Renegade Boomers. It's Tina Lorenz, and it's time for the Renegade Boomer podcast. And I'm really delighted to introduce our guest today, Margaret-Ann Cole. Margaret-Ann is an empowering senior executive, an entrepreneur, an advisor, a thought leader, and a board member with over 25 years experience. I love the decades of experience. I can relate to that. And as a Forbes HR Council member with guest appearances on CNN, Bright Talk, and Talent Development Hot Seat, she brings a unique perspective and obviously a wealth of experience to leadership and workforce transformation. Particularly, we're going to talk about ageism today. And she's worked with executive teams from companies like Coca-Cola and Johnson & Johnson and other Fortune 500 companies. So welcome, Margaret-Ann. I'm so happy to have you here on the Renegade Boomer podcast today.
Well, thank you, Tina. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Yeah, well, I want to discuss all of these experiences you've had in the workplace, but let's start off by talking about your setting, because we chatted for a minute before we began today, and I said, tell me about your background there. What's on your ceiling? So can you talk a little bit about that for a minute?
Absolutely. So this is a collection of artwork that I have from my children from preschool all the way to high school. They're both in college now, and it creates this really warm and inviting place for me in my home office. So I always feel really comfortable when I'm working from home. And also during the pandemic, I was a chief people officer for Porter Novelli, and I felt that this space really created that comfortable, safe space so people could feel comfortable speaking with me and we could talk about anything. And I love the vibe, and it just makes me feel very good when I'm here.
Well, I can totally relate to creating the vibe of your office. And I find myself kind of going like, trying to look at what's on your ceiling to see some of that artwork. But I just love that, because one of the things I think is so important for us, especially now in this time, we still, even since the pandemic, connecting so much with Zoom calls, of what is behind you? Where are you sitting? What is that feeling that you're creating? And so I'm happy to hear you feel like that's really important. As soon as the pandemic got going and all the news people, I was kidding with you that everybody had a white bookcase full of books, and they were stacking their laptops on top of another stack of books. So we weren't looking up a left nostril or something like that. But,
right, exactly.
Yeah, but it's just an important thing to remember in our communication and our relating, to the people that we're talking to. So I wanted to ask you, I was doing my homework, learning more about what you do, and you mentioned ageism. So I wanted to start just by asking you, what kind of things are you noticing that can start to happen, especially for those of us as we get past 50 that kind of fit into that realm of ageism? Because it's just almost like we're relearning even some of the things we might say ourselves about ourselves or about age that we need to be aware of and thinking about changing. So what are some of your experiences with that?
Sure. So there's a lot of things. I think that language is really important when you think about ageism. Some of the language that you use can date yourself. So if you use the word seasoned or experience, etc., people think, hey, how old is really this person? And I have found with other people as well as myself, a resume goes through and they see some of these words and they immediately take the resume off the table, because in lots of ways people do age themselves. And the way people age themselves is by the language that they use or the language that they're not comfortable with. And I do know that a lot of people have experienced during interviews, because part of my career has been to do a lot of coaching, especially with people in their careers, and helping them go through and prep for interviews, etc. And there's lots of language that people use. They use like flexibility and technology in a way that's kind of meant to trap someone, as to say, well, exactly how old are you? And it's really a shame, because if you look at engagement, so there's lots of engagement studies, like every company is concerned about engagement, because if you have good engaged employees, then you have high retention rates, et cetera, and high productivity. So when you look at engagement, what people have found, Gallup is probably, the head in the space. What they've found is that older workers are actually more engaged and will actually be retained longer. And it's interesting because that's not something that kind of sits in people's brains easily. And so hiring managers are cutting off a whole host of opportunity to get people who would probably be better employees, and they'd get a lot more value out of. But, they see your experience level and they think, wow, too old, too expensive.
Yeah, overqualified, right?
Right.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few kind of buzzwords. Even though we talk a lot about entrepreneurship, there's still people working in corporate settings and that type of thing. So what are some of the buzzwords as far as, okay, say this instead of that, kind of like eat this instead of that, you know?
Right. Yeah. So clearly, using the word agile for you to talk about your agility, because everything is about how fast things move. Energy, right? They always talk about, do you have enough energy? So also coming across with a lot of enthusiasm and energy is important. And to talk about how enthusiastic you are and how energetic you are, because people think, oh, well, somebody who's older doesn't have energy. And that's why I love this whole concept with your renegade boomers, because clearly people in their 50s and 60s, they have lots of room and runway and they've got lots of energy. You have to have, because people's lifespans are now at 100 years, not at 60 or 70 years the way that you were before. So you have to have energy in order to be healthy and live through your retirement. And being able to use some technology terms, because I think that it is possible that some older workers are a little bit confounded by, the cybersecurity and the AI, et cetera. So it's always really helpful for people to do like a really good refresher course and talk about those. So they're not really kind of put off their game when they're answering questions. The other thing too is when people talk about, well, you're really experienced. I mean, that should be a good thing, but a lot of times it works against somebody when they say, well, you've got a lot of experience. Well, yeah, and that should be a good thing. And you should be really super happy that I have a lot of experience.
So we should be like flexibly agile using Zoom.
Well, so here's a little funny aside. So when I was at Right Management, one of the things that Right Management does is it works with executives who are transitioning, so outplacement services. And one of the things that we did even before the pandemic was we would work with individuals to have them video themselves. Because many times when you're interviewing for a board position or a big global job, you're more than likely not even on the same continent, let alone the same time zone. So you're going to more than likely be in a video conference of some sort, and now it's Zoom. So making sure that people felt comfortable with how they were coming across. So here's one funny story. We had this one guy and he kept saying, I don't understand why I'm not getting any traction and whatever. So we actually had him go and do a mock interview and video himself. And then we went through the video with him. And what he noticed is that he was so staid that his shoulders never moved. So there was no life there. And so we're like, okay, so, you don't want to look like a buzzing bee, but you do, in fact, want to come across and show your energy and your style in your life. So I think it's really important for people to be comfortable in the medium that they're using so that they don't come across kind of tired or too stiff.
Yeah, it's funny. All I can picture is holding a mirror up to the camera to see if he was breathing. But that's the thing. I mean, a lot of people don't realize you can practice on Zoom. You can just go into your own Zoom account and record and see how it came across and how it looked and all of those things. You can do that. And, this carries over into entrepreneurship because a lot of times then, just like we're meeting on Zoom right now for this podcast interview, or you might be dealing with a client or having a client call. So I think all of these things apply to how are you coming across when you're on camera, right?
Right, exactly. And some people are just nervous because many people are introverts. There's as many introverts as there are extroverts. And many introverts also, they just like manifest as extroverts when they aren't really. So they're actually forcing themselves to be lively and to be engaged and to listen actively. So it's really important for people just to be comfortable in whatever setting they're in, whether they're in a meeting, whether they're on Zoom, whether even if they're, old school and just talking on the phone. You want to make sure some of who you are comes out. I'm all about being authentic and letting your real personality shine through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a funny thing, especially with entrepreneurship, a lot of us are kind of probably more introverted than one might think because we work alone a lot of the time,
Yes. And it's very lonely. I mean, yeah. I think that's the hardest thing about being an entrepreneur is you don't realize how lonely it is because you're relying on yourself. You're leading yourself. You're following yourself. So everything is about how you're making yourself feel. And I have to tell you that I really would kind of like to get more back into a corporate environment because I miss the interaction. Yeah, I work with my clients, but it's different than working every day with someone and collaborating and brainstorming and all the things that, I've enjoyed throughout my career. So it can be lonely. And I think that that's hard for some people to deal with.
Well, that's another reason I'm glad we're having this conversation, because we talk a lot about entrepreneurship, but there are people that still would prefer to have that interaction, have a place that they go every day. Maybe they want to get out of the house, that kind of thing. So one of the statistics I just saw recently on the news was something like 2 million people have left the workforce, and it's baby boomer retirements. So what do you think about that? Do you think that that was more of a forced exit, or do you think that it's because, well, they didn't want to deal with some of the things of the pandemic? Or what do you think's happening with that kind of mass exodus?
I think it's a couple of things. So I think that when you look at corporations, especially when they've been experienced, and many corporations have, look at Facebook, how many tens of thousands did they let go? I guess they're Meta now. I have to make sure I call them by the right name.
Sideways 8, yeah.
Right. But the reality is that when people are doing some of those layoffs, who do they lay off? They lay off the most expensive, and typically the most expensive are also the older workers. And granted, there's all of the age impact and all of the studies that you have to do when you're considering a large layoff like that. But the reality is that the older workers are probably disadvantaged the most. So there's probably a lot of boomers who fell into that. I think also too, when you have a 30 or 40-year career and you've been working with folks, sometimes you just get tired. I mean, you just get the wear and tear, and you do kind of want to retrench. So I think there are some people who just actively said, hey, you know what, I'm just going to step back. And then there are folks like me. I actually was working with Porter Novelli, and we got a new CEO, and he wanted to bring his own team in. So I stepped aside. And so I didn't really want to go back into the whole corporate thing right away. And so did my own thing for a while. So I could have the best of both worlds, right? So I could do some of my consulting, interact with my clients, but also retrench a little bit, because I have to tell you, I was exhausted after the pandemic. Being a chief people officer during a pandemic was probably one of the most challenging parts of my career, period, stand down, end of story.
Yeah, really. I mean, so many things that had to change and have remained changed, So, I mean, you hear people say, oh, it's never going to go back. But I don't think it's going back to what we knew before, because it's still out there. We're just dealing with it in a different way now. So let's talk about entrepreneurship a little bit, because the whole anti-retirement movement is not necessarily that you should continue to work 80 hours a week or have board meetings every Wednesday or whatever it might be, but how can people blend that experience? Because the reality, I mean, let's speak about that for a moment. The reality of being in your 50s or 60s or even 70s and thinking, I'm going to apply for it. What's the reality with that as far as getting overlooked or getting marginalized?
It's pretty high, right? I mean, and I think that this is the reason. So ageism is just one of the isms that you have to deal with in the, corporate world. So part of the reason I think that we have as much lack of diversity as we do is because hiring managers typically want to hire in their own image. So if I'm a 40-something millennial, a white male, more than likely that's who I'm comfortable with hiring. Now, yes, it's a little bit of a stereotype, but it's kind of like back in your brain. And that's where the whole unconscious bias is. You don't even realize you're doing it. And so, as somebody who's consulted with HR and hiring managers for most of my career, I've found that it is really hard to get people out of their comfort zone and to think about people with what I refer to as adjacent skills. So people who can do the job, but haven't done exactly that job before. And that's where you get a bigger pool of people. And that's where you can really make sure that you're really getting a diverse candidate population, that you're hiring people who bring diversity, that you're more inclusive. And I think that age is just one of those things that you have to get to the hiring managers to kind of break them of that habit. So I think it's just really hard for people to get into these corporate or senior level jobs in their 50s and 60s. Although you could run for president, that's no problem, right? Like our current president, our prior president, both well into their 70s, no problem. They got jobs. But I do think that there is this idea and we always used to consult around this too when I was at Right Management, this idea of a portfolio career. So this is where you talk about being an entrepreneur. So if I start my own business, I can do some consulting, I could become a board member, I could write a book, I could blog, I could do what you're doing, right? So there's so many different things that I could do and have a very fulfilling career, but not in the traditional sense.
Absolutely. And, I'm all for that. And I think it's the solution for a lot of people that still, and not only do they want to have significance, I say they, but, a lot of us in this age category, but also want to continue to earn, I mean,
Well,
eggs at $5 a dozen,
even more over in the Northeast. And I have 2 kids in college, right? So, I mean, I have to make sure that, they can have their college career and not be saddled with a mountain of debt as they enter the workforce. So, yeah, it's really a concern. And I think that, I just saw a comment. I saw that Jenny had commented, and it really spurred a thought. This idea that hiring managers, hiring somebody who could be their parents' age. Yeah. So when people become managers, a lot of times people are put into the people leadership role without any training whatsoever. And I think that that's really something that needs to be constantly monitored at any point in the workforce, because putting somebody in a leadership role without giving them all the tools to succeed is not good for them. It's not good for the organization. So some of that training can be, opening up their eyes to the possibilities. The other thing too that just reminded me of, I mentioned earlier that my daughter had a film in the Allentown Film Festival, and I went with her to that, and I spent the day at her college campus because she was working. She's also stage manager for the production that they were doing, and they were doing it that night. And I hung with her friends all day, to the point where one of her friends knew we had an extra ticket and chose to come and be my date. So, I mean, maybe we just need to get them really young and get them used to that they can have this interaction and fun time with people who are not necessarily just their age. But once again, that goes to what you expose people to.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, the expectation for ourselves, because, I'm imagining you weren't sitting there going, well, I'm too old to have this conversation, to have relevant interaction with this person. You probably just enjoyed meeting them and had some laughs and had something in common with the interests, all of those things. And I think with my background being entrepreneurial forever, for several decades, I'm used to being in masterminds and different kinds of groups where a lot of people were half my age, if not more sometimes. And just our own expectation that we still have conversations. We're not isolating ourselves from them. We're not judging them as well.
Right.
Reversing the discrimination, so to speak, or the ism, and just knowing that there's something to learn in both directions. Right.
Right. I mean, there was a time when the whole idea of mentorship is so important. There was a time, and I still am a proponent of this, where you kind of match people up. So a younger upcoming leader with an older, more experienced individual, because the two of them can be so much stronger, especially like if you're in a technology firm, that could be unbelievably fruitful, because the older person will have run into different scenarios that they can help the younger worker kind of navigate where they haven't had to do that before. And the younger person can help open the eyes of the more mature leader to help them understand, okay, this is how the technology can be deployed and what we could do with it, et cetera. I mean, technology is so easy now. When we were younger, it was really hard. You had to be a coder, you had to understand it, but now everything's an app. I mean, there's not anything you can't figure out. I mean, what's easier to use than an iPhone?
Yeah. I don't know. Getting that email on your iPhone can be a moment. But the thing is, if we open ourselves up to that, we can learn as we go. I don't have the stats right in front of me, but it's really kind of eye-opening that the baby boomer generation actually is using a lot of these devices more than the younger generation. More hours with the phone, more time online. And obviously there's technology involved in that. So I think not presupposing that we can't learn some new skills and constantly making fun of ourselves, like, oh, I can't do that, and finding out you might be able to do way more than you think, and that's for a lot of people that started with Zoom,
Right,
the survival mechanism. But so when we're looking at how someone can put together their previous experience. I feel like there's so much brilliance and wisdom that can be carried forward and turned into one of these entrepreneurial endeavors. What do you want your life to look like? What kind of a fabric can you weave that it isn't all one way or the other? You have to act this way in this setting and this way. Instead, it's just your life, whether you're being a consultant, whether you have online programs, whether you're active on a board, any of those things that just dovetails together with the rest of your lifestyle. And especially with this technology, that we can do that from anywhere. We can still travel. We can still be in an exotic location if we choose to. I'm not the laptop in the sand kind of person, but
But you could be.
You could be. Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have those times of just, I do want to just sit on the beach and stare at the water. What do you think about that as far as a solution for kind of retirement?
Well, I think it's a really good solution to it, because otherwise, I mean, if you're not moving forward, you stagnate and you get old. And that's what you really want to avoid. I think, the statistics, I don't know them off the top of my head, but the statistics do lead you to believe that people who retire earlier, spend a lot of time in retirement, they're the ones who develop Alzheimer's or health issues, et cetera, because they're not active, they're not using all of their capacity. So if we are in this world of the 100-year life, there's that book 100-year life, then the reality is that we have to continue to maintain our vibrancy however we can. And so and this is a total aside, but think about like what happened in France when they tried to change the retirement age by
fire to the Eiffel Tower.
My husband said, wow, you got to give it to the French. They can mobilize immediately.
It's a new French resistance.
Right, exactly. He goes, give them a cause and they go right at it. But the reality is that so there is a mandatory retirement age for many careers. So the whole idea of being an entrepreneur and doing lots of different things, I think, is really one that most people have to consider. And you talked a little bit about this idea of continuous learning. Mm-hmm. That's the key, right? You have to constantly be willing to learn and do something new and different. And for me, I love that, because that's part of the reason I became a consultant early on, because I would get bored easily. So the way to avoid being bored is making sure that you're doing lots of different things. And when you're doing lots of different things, you have to learn about them so that you can deploy your techniques correctly, et cetera. So perfect example, I was well into my career before I did my MBA, and it was a global MBA. And just 4 years ago, I did my global talent leadership designation from Wharton. So I have to stop myself to say, oh, that would be a great course. Let me take that, because I would love that. And here's how I could use it in my everyday life. So I just do think that the whole idea of doing these portfolio careers is what's going to keep the boomer generation, alive and thriving.
Yeah. And I mean, science backs it up that the new neural pathways we develop as we are learning and creating new habits, new ways of thinking, it does. And I saw the stats on a study, again, I don't have them at my fingertips, but it was a study, ironically, done in France that proves something along the lines of adding 2.3 years per each year working past retirement age, adding to your potential lifespan just by that one thing. And there's a new book out by Becca Levy that it's all about the statistics and the science behind our expectation of how long we will live impacts how long we will live. I mean, you hear the stories all the time of the person that worked all their life, retired, did nothing, and suddenly that was it. They were gone within a year or two of their retirement, never had a chance to enjoy the thing they thought they were looking forward to. So, I mean, I think there is something as far as health and vitality and energy, all of those things, sort of a youth formula maybe is to stay actively engaged. And I think for a lot of people too, that maybe they've had that 30-year career and now it's like, maybe they've already made oodles of money and they're fine financially. And that's not the most urgent thing for them, but they still want to have impact or have that kind of legacy aspect of their life of, this is my legacy project. This is the thing that I feel I'm called to. Maybe it's completely different than what they did. Maybe they were an architect for 30 years and now they're going to be opening a restaurant, or whatever it may be. How do you feel about those kinds of transitions for people as we're growing older?
So as you said that, it reminded me of a friend. A friend of mine went into, it was Wall Street investment banker. And then all of a sudden, I would say about 10 years ago, he decided, you know what, this is not what really lights me up. And I always wanted to be an architect. So he became an
Oh,
architect.
oh, that's funny.
And so it was just like, a little bit opposite of what you just
Yeah.
described. And he's doing all this design work and he's so much happier as an individual. Now, is he making the big investment dollars and did he cut himself off from some of that? Absolutely. But, weigh it out, a comfortable living, being happy versus, oodles and boodles of money and being really, really unhappy. So I think it's important. And I always felt that with my career, so just for me personally, I always felt like I had to pay my dues, which was to have the corporate job and do the whole, 9 to 5, which it was never 9 to 5. It was like, 8 to 8 at a minimum, and traveling Monday through Friday, which, that's a whole different ball of wax. But the reality is pay your dues so that you could do what you want to do. So what do I want to do? Well, I really do want to write a book, both a professional book as well as a personal book. So 2 books. I also love to travel. So currently I'm not doing a lot of that because I have a 91-year-old aunt who lives with me because she can't live on her own. And so I have to be close to home currently, but that's just currently. Also giving back. So I am a board a director for Rebuilding Together New York City. And I love that. I've been a part of that since 2014, and I will continue to be a part of it because we help people keep their homes healthy and safe when they can't afford to do it for themselves. And that's so rewarding. So, someone who doesn't necessarily need the money, all of their years of experience, there are so many different ways they can deploy their experience. And even if it's to be a advisor to somebody who's starting their own company, so somebody who's starting out to be an entrepreneur, maybe they could have somebody be their mentor to help them through what they have to do to start the business and get it to be viable.
See, this is why I'm particularly so happy to have you as a guest today, because really just exploring these different options. And like your friend that wanted to become an architect, have you ever found that people that went through their decades of corporate, whatever their positions, maybe they've been a doctor, whatever it may be, that they almost lose sometimes that, who am I really at the core?
Well, truthfully, I struggle with that a little bit, right? Because if I'm not this consultant, so here's a personal story. My daughter is now 19 and in college. However, when she was 13, I was working for Accenture traveling Monday through Friday, basically. And so I wasn't home. And it was really beginning to take its toll on her. And 13 for a young woman is a pivotal age. And what I was finding is that I could have chosen to continue to be married to my career and to continue to travel and have her suffer for it, or I could retrench. And so I decided to retrench. Now, it was the right thing to do for her. It was the right thing to do for all of my family ultimately. But I have to tell you, I really struggled with that because I was like, if I am not this big, bad consultant, on the road warrior, coming in, helping you solve your problems, who am I really? But, when I think about it, that's what I do. I solve problems. I solve problems for my family. I solve problems for the board that I work with in my own personal consulting. I help people solve problems. So I kind of had to really rethink, well, who am I and how do I take the way that I've been focused and kind of just spin it just a little bit differently so that I can take what I'm really good at and deploy it in a way that's good for me and good for my family.
Did it take you very long to make that transition as far as your own personal identity, self-esteem, all of those things?
Yeah, so I would say, in the scheme of things, it probably took me a good 6 months before I said, okay, this is who I'm going to be now. And then actually, I did become a chief people officer for Porter Novelli. And even then, it took me a little while. Okay, so now I'm not technically a consultant, but I am a consultant in this role because they also needed me to help transform their organization. And then the pandemic hit. So I kind of had to even rethink how I was going to approach the whole role, et cetera, because there were so many different things that we had to be concerned about during the pandemic and the welfare of our people in a different way than we had, pre-pandemic.
Isn't it interesting how life hands us these opportunities too, because sometimes something appears to us and our immediate reaction might be, oh no, I couldn't do that. But then if it's appearing, maybe it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
Is it happening for us or to us? And if we just trust in that, kind of lean into that, well, okay, let me explore this. And it prepared you. What strikes me is that your journey of, okay, so here's this issue with my daughter, and now I'm choosing this role. My mother role needs to be at the top here, and I'm going to change even though it's difficult. But that prepared you, it seems to me, to be ready to make yet another pivot when the pandemic began and how you were going to work with people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that I am a big believer in the universe provides you with what you need, not what you want, what you need. And sometimes you just have to trust that the universe knows even a little bit better than you do. And Robin Roberts, I saw her speak and she was just giving a personal anecdote. And, what she had said is that the universe wasn't saying no to her. What the universe was saying was not now. So sometimes what you want is not right for you at that moment. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen at some point, but just not at that moment. And I think that a lot of times we aren't present. We're not present in our conversations. We're always thinking about the next thing we're going to say, or we're thinking about the next thing we're going to do, or we're thinking about what we're going to cook for dinner, or when we go to somebody's house, what's it going to be like? And because of that, we're not getting all of the information from the situation that we're in to really truly take advantage of it.
Yeah, well, I've heard this referred to as the not now future and the not now past. I mean, even this conversation 5 minutes from now is not now. And so I think that's another really interesting thing to ponder with all of that, because it's all just our imaginings, the thoughts that we have about what something might be like in the future. And I've often said I'm a very visual thinker. So, I mean, I can be picturing what the place is going to look like that I've never been to before, that we're going to, or what side of the road it's going to be on. I mean, one time it was kind of funny because my husband was legally blind. And I said, well, don't you picture, or, like, do you think sort of visually, like what the place is going to look like or what the experience? And he was like, no. And I was kind of like, well, what's in there then in your head? What's filling up space if you're not picturing this? But since then, I've learned more that it's all just our imagination anyway,
And the way that you look at something. So I remember I was a kid, I was a teenager, and I read something, it was probably one of the teen magazines, and they had this anecdote about Barbara Streisand. And Barbara Streisand said, here, I'm not feeling good about myself, and I feel defeated and whatever, and this is what I look like. And she goes, and now I feel I am the best, and I'm so great, and I'm wonderful, and I feel good. And the difference between how she looked in each of those pictures was unbelievable, right? I mean, it was night and day. And all it was the difference of an attitude.
Yeah, and it's an energy. I mean, there is an actual energy. We talk about the energy and all that, but it's a real thing because, you feel that lowering of your energy if you go into that kind of depressed mode or feeling down on yourself. It's a downward kind of deal where when you feel the lift, literally feel that energetic lift, and it's real.
And also, I guess the neuroscience, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but if you were in a bad mood or a depressed mood and you look backward, you think of your past very negatively and you dwell on all the negative things that happened. And then if you're in an upbeat mood and you think about it, you're like, wow, I had great trajectory. Look at the road I took to get here. Haven't I had an amazing run? So it's really, trying to get to the best possible mindset you can is the difference for how successful or unsuccessful you really are.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I call habits of thought. And sometimes how we will defend to the death, literally, our negative outcomes or our negative stories that we tell ourselves, like, oh no, it's always this way for me, this kind of thing. Where if we just allow ourselves to choose really that we're going to think it in a different way, it does change the energy and it does change how you present to the world. I mean, so we're talking about this thing with Zoom calls and whether it's interviews or whether you're dealing with clients, taking that time to change your state, not moving to New Jersey or Arizona, but change your state of being, your state of mind of how you're coming across. I talk about like dogs can sense fear and horses can sense your anxiety. Well, people can too.
Exactly. So I've done a lot of executive coaching. And when I work with someone who I can feel like really they're not feeling as strong as they can, they're feeling intimidated, they're feeling less than worthy. The exercise I give them is to go into the mirror every morning for 30 days and do a positive thinking. I've done this really well and I'm really feeling good and whatever. Just like there's the 28-day program for people with addiction, because if you do something for 28 days, it sticks. I mean, so that's what I would advise people to do is like, get up in the morning, look in the mirror and say, I am going to have a great day. I am feeling good. I'm going to contribute. I'm going to listen. I'm going to be there. I'm going to have interactions with wonderful people. And that's what happens.
Well,
so it kind of manifests it.
That mirror activity is something powerful, because if you look in your own eyes in a mirror and speak to yourself, it's a powerful thing.
It really is.
Make eye contact with yourself is a powerful thing. So I highly recommend it as well, because it can be kind of life altering and even emotional at times to meet yourself in that way. Because a lot of times we avoid that. We might look in the mirror and go, how do I look? And is everything okay? But as far as really facing off with yourself, that's a whole different thing. It's a whole different
And I mean, I don't know, you probably like this too, because many overachievers are, and I'm clearly an overachiever. I am always so hard on myself, and I have to dial myself back and say, you know what? You can't look at every blemish. You have to look at the big picture. It's like a George Seurat painting, right? If you get really close, all you see are the dots, but when you back away, you see this marvelous, amazing impressionist painting.
And it's so easy to be hard on ourselves. One of my things that I often say is, if you're an entrepreneurial person, especially, the worst client you'll ever have is yourself.
Yeah, nobody's harder on you than you are. It's true. It's
and it comes to, because I've taught copywriting and marketing strategy for years. And so also when you're writing your own copy for something, worst client you'll ever have.
Right, exactly.
It suddenly becomes very difficult.
Right, it's so true.
I've been loving this conversation, and I just thank you so much for being here today. And I think that you've really given some great advice and great insights to those that are going to watch this and listen to this later as well. So how can people find you? Because you're still doing consulting and coaching, that type of thing. Is that correct, Margaret-Ann?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. I am. So I'm on LinkedIn. Also, I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. But I think LinkedIn is really the best. I also have my own website, but it's a little bit tricky to get to. It used to be a lot easier, so I'll have to change it. So LinkedIn is really the best way. It's Margaret-Ann Cole, and there's not that many of us. Although when you do Google me, I do find that Margaret-Ann Cole was a very popular name in like the 1800s.
Oh, that's funny. Well, there's probably a whole lot of interesting stories. Just imagine what those people were like in the 1800s.
Right.
Well, thanks so much for being here today, and I look forward to having another conversation one day soon.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Tina. This is lovely.
Hey, folks, thanks for sticking around. If you'd like more of this great content, check out these videos on the page. And if you're new here, be sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss a thing. And I'll talk to you again soon.